When I saw him standing at the edge of the parking lot, holding her hand, I felt my world tilt in a way it hadn't for 15 years. Not because I feared being caught, but because I knew what would come next. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not today. Not in that part of town. And certainly not watching the man my daughter had just called Daddy bend down to fix the strap of her backpack. I froze. It felt like the universe had opened a trapdoor beneath my feet, but somehow I didn't fall. I just stood there, smiling weakly, waving with the kind of forced normalcy that only guilt can teach. My husband didn't wave back. He didn't even blink. His gaze stayed fixed on the child, our daughter, or so he thought, and the man beside her. A man he'd never met. A man I had spent over a decade loving in silence. My stomach clenched when I saw his jaw tighten, the vein in his temple pulse. He wasn't the kind of man to shout or accuse. He was the kind who observed, then remembered. And punished you quietly with what he knew. I wanted to run across the lot and explain it all, right there, with carts rattling and strangers passing by. But there was no way to explain 15 years of lies. There was no quick summary for why our daughter laughed exactly like someone he didn't know. I watched as he turned without a word, keys clenched tight in his fist, and walked back to his car. I felt my throat close. My knees almost gave out. My daughter waved at me, her eyes bright, oblivious. And I realized, the clock had started ticking. Because what he saw today wasn't even the full truth. Not yet. There was one detail, one devastating detail, that I had hidden even from myself. And soon, he'd uncover it too. So let me tell you how it all began, long before that parking lot. Before the silence turned into a weapon. And before I let a lie become my whole life. But before I share with you the secret I've buried for over a decade, tell me, have you ever kept a truth so dark it changed the way you looked in the mirror? Drop your city in the comments and let me know, have you ever loved two people at the same time? It started slowly, the way most catastrophes do. Quiet, unnoticed, almost graceful in how it blends with the ordinary. I didn't plan to live two lives. I just didn't stop myself when the door cracked open. Back then, I was still trying to be a perfect wife. Meals hot. Laundry folded. Lipstick always reapplied before he walked in. He never asked for any of that, but he noticed when I didn't do it. His praise was rare, but his disappointment clung to the walls like mildew. He wasn't cruel. That would have made things easier, clearer. Instead, he was absent in a way that made me question if I still existed at all. A ghost with responsibilities, polite, loyal, occasionally affectionate. But not once in years had he looked at me with hunger. Not even with curiosity. So when I met the other man, years ago, at a community fundraiser of all places, it felt like being touched by light after years underground. He didn't flirt, not openly. But his eyes lingered. He listened. And when I laughed, he did too, not because the joke was good, but because my joy seemed to move something in him. One meeting became 3. Then 6. Then Monday afternoons that slipped into early evenings. I told myself I was selfish. Then I told myself I was surviving. Then I stopped explaining it at all. By the time I got pregnant, I had already buried the truth so deep it had roots. I didn't know what to do. I didn't even cry. I just stared at the bathroom mirror, waiting for the reflection to tell me who I was supposed to be. I told my husband I wanted to adopt. That I felt a calling. That we had more to give. He resisted at first, said we were too old, that it was too much responsibility. But I was relentless, kind but firm, the way a woman must be when she's cornered by her own lies. And then she arrived. My daughter. My daughter who shared my laugh and his eyes, not my husband's, but the man I met in secret. She was everything pure and beautiful, and I hated myself a little more each time she called the wrong man Dad. She never knew. Of course she didn't. Children love what's in front of them. They mirror your comfort. And I worked hard to stay calm, to make the lie soft and warm, like a blanket wrapped too tightly. The man, her real father, stayed in the background. He never pushed. He never demanded. He loved us from the edges, like a shadow that kept its distance out of respect. Or fear. Or both. We had a system. Mondays were ours. A walk, an hour at the park, sometimes just coffee in his apartment while she played in the next room. She knew him as a family friend. She adored him. He never tried to explain their connection. I think he wanted her to love him naturally, without confusion. And she did. Meanwhile, my marriage coasted. We functioned well enough. We attended events, smiled in photos, sent Christmas cards. If anyone suspected, they never said. And if my husband ever wondered, if he ever looked too closely at her face and thought about timelines, he never let it show. But something changed recently. Attention crept in. He'd watch me longer. He started asking where I went. Not suspiciously, more like a man trying to remember the contours of something he once knew. He'd brush my hand and pause, as if the texture surprised him. Then came the parking lot. That day shattered the careful architecture I'd built for 15 years. He saw something. Not enough to accuse. But enough to begin digging. He didn't confront me. That wasn't his way. But I saw the shift. He came home earlier. Asked more questions. Noted things I used to be able to hide. The margin for error closed. And in that shrinking space, I began to suffocate. He began to treat our daughter differently. Not cruelly, just with distance. A hesitation before hugs. Longer looks. Silence where warmth used to be. I noticed. And so did she. She came to me the next morning and asked, "Did I do something wrong? Why doesn't Dad laugh with me like before?" I wanted to tell her everything. But how do you explain betrayal in a language a child can understand? So I told her the only thing I could. He's just tired. Grown-ups get tired sometimes. And I thought, maybe I could fix this. Patch it up. Hide better. Be smarter. But deep down, I knew, it was already too late. The moment he saw us in that parking lot, the fuse was lit. And the explosion was only a matter of time. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake with my back to him, the sheets between us like a line I couldn't cross. His breathing was steady, mechanical, as if he had shut down a part of himself to make it through the night. I listened to every exhale like it might carry meaning, like it might turn into a word, or a sigh, or anything that would give me permission to speak. But he said nothing. Just silence. Morning came with a cruel brightness. The kind that seeps through closed curtains and makes everything you've hidden visible. He sat at the edge of the bed for a moment before rising, as if he were considering saying something. Instead, he walked to the bathroom, closed the door gently behind him. The lock clicked. I felt it echo in my ribs. Downstairs, I packed her lunch like always. Peanut butter sandwich, no crust, 2 apple slices, a note with a heart drawn on it. Routine was safety. Routine was the illusion that nothing had changed. She ran in wearing her school sweater backward, laughing. Her shoes were mismatched. She looked exactly like him, her real father, when she smiled like that. But I couldn't dwell. I kissed her forehead and fixed her collar, all while my heart thudded behind a mask of domestic calm. He drove her to school without saying a word to me. Not even a goodbye. By 10 a.m., I was pacing. I couldn't reach out to anyone. Not my sister, not my friends, not even him. The man I had loved all these years. I thought of calling, but what would I say? That my husband might have figured it out? That our careful scaffolding of lies was starting to sway? I didn't know what he had seen exactly, or what conclusions he'd drawn. But I knew my husband. He didn't jump. He watched, gathered, calculated. Which made him more dangerous than someone who yelled. He would wait. Wait for me to hang myself with my own truth. Around noon, I found myself driving. Not anywhere specific, just moving. Past the school, past the coffee shop where we used to meet, past the apartment I used to say belonged to a client when I needed to disappear for an hour. I didn't stop until I reached a narrow park on the outskirts of town. A place I hadn't visited in years. We had brought her there once, when she was just a toddler. She'd fallen in the mud, and he, my husband, had lifted her like she was made of glass. He'd laughed. So had I. Back then, things were simpler, if not entirely honest. I remembered thinking, maybe this could work. Maybe I could live both lives, keep both truths. But the moment in the parking lot changed that. My phone buzzed. A message from him. Are you okay? Just that. From the other man. I stared at the words for a long time. I didn't answer. Because no, I wasn't okay. And yes, I wanted to tell him everything. But the truth had grown teeth. It wasn't something I could speak and survive. By evening, I was back home, pretending to read while my husband prepared dinner. It was absurd, really. He never cooked. But there he was, slicing onions like it was therapy. I watched him from the hallway, watched the slow, precise movements of his hands. He was trying to act normal. That was new. Usually, he avoided pretense. But now he was pretending too. So we had entered that final stage, both playing roles, waiting for the curtain to fall. Dinner was silent except for her. She told us about a science project, something with baking soda and vinegar. He nodded, smiled at the right moments. I passed the salad. It was like watching a movie we'd all seen before but couldn't change. When she went upstairs to shower, he finally looked at me. I saw you, he said quietly. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Where? At the plaza. Yesterday. I set the fork down, slowly. I was just. I know who he is, he said, not looking away. At least now I do. There it was. Not an accusation. Not a question. A statement. A verdict. I didn't plan for this to happen, I said, voice low. He nodded. Doesn't matter. It did. He stood up, took his plate to the sink. Washed it. Methodical. Mechanical. I sat still, afraid that if I moved, the world would shift again. Does she know? He asked over his shoulder. I shook my head. No. She thinks he's a family friend. He dried his hands, turned to me. And you were planning to keep it that way? I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. I hadn't planned any of this. Every step I took led to a new lie I had to cover. And then one day, the lies became the only path forward. He sighed. I'm not angry. I thought I would be. But I'm not. That hurt more than shouting ever could. What are you then? I asked. Done, he said. I'm just done trying to believe in something that clearly never existed. I felt something shatter in my chest. Not my heart. That broke long ago. This was different. This was the realization that I had lost something that could never be repaired, not even with truth. She came down the stairs in her pajamas, hair damp, asking for a bedtime story. He kissed her forehead, told her to pick her favorite book. I watched them walk up together, his hand on her small shoulder. I stayed downstairs, alone in the quiet hum of a house that had once held hope. Later that night, I went to the drawer where I kept the old photos. The ones from her early days. I pulled out one with the three of us, me, him, and our daughter. The smiles looked real. Maybe they were. Maybe we had moments of truth inside the lie. I don't know when I fell asleep, only that I woke to the sound of a door closing. He had gone for a run. That was his way. When the world pressed too close, he ran. I didn't know if he'd come back this time. But I knew one thing, the illusion was over. And what was left behind was a life I no longer knew how to live. I thought I could manage the unraveling. That if I just kept moving through the motions, kept packing lunches and folding towels and attending school recitals, the rest would settle into silence. I thought he might get over it. That he'd swallow it down the way men of his generation often did, quietly, with bitterness and restraint, and maybe a sudden new interest in woodworking. But I was wrong. He wasn't swallowing anything. He was digesting it slowly, methodically, and with unsettling calm. The days that followed were heavier than the days after a funeral. At least in mourning, there are rituals, flowers, casseroles, condolences. This was weight without language. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. But his absence grew louder with each hour. Not physical absence, but something deeper, like the echo left behind when someone has taken their soul and left their body behind just to fill the space. Every night, we lay in the same bed. But the distance between us was growing. It wasn't measured in inches or feet. It was measured in lost years. In things unsaid. In my daughter's laughter, which now made him flinch more than smile. She asked one morning if something was wrong. I smiled too quickly, too wide. Told her we were just tired. Grown-up tired. The kind that doesn't go away with sleep. She accepted it, because she trusted me. I wondered how long that trust would last. I wanted to call the other man. Desperately. To ask him what to do. To ask if he still believed we had done the right thing, choosing silence over truth. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. He was part of the problem now. Not the villain, no. But no longer the safe place he once was. One afternoon, I found my husband in the garage. He was going through boxes. Not loudly, not in rage. Just moving through them, slowly, like he was sorting through memories to decide which ones were real. He held up a photograph of us, me, him, and her, at the beach when she was 5. We looked perfect. Happy. He looked at it for a long time, then placed it in a box marked keep. I stood silently in the doorway, watching him sort through the past, deciding what to salvage. Later that evening, he surprised me. He said he wanted to take a short trip. Just the three of us. Somewhere quiet. He said it with a straight face, like it was an ordinary idea, like he hadn't just spent the last week silently dissecting our marriage. I didn't ask why. I agreed. Because I couldn't predict what would happen if I refused. We packed light. A few changes of clothes, some snacks, books for the car. Our daughter was thrilled. She thought we were going on an adventure. In a way, we were. The drive was long and winding, through familiar country roads. We passed places we used to visit before everything became complicated. Before I'd split myself in two. He pointed out landmarks we hadn't seen in years. She giggled in the back seat, asking questions about cows and wind turbines. I watched him from the passenger seat. He drove like a man with a purpose. Not just to reach a destination, but to get somewhere internally. He wasn't escaping. He was confronting something. When we arrived at the cabin, it was just as I remembered. A place we had rented twice, long ago, before she was born. Nestled between tall pines, with a view of a still lake and the hush of a world left behind. That night, we sat on the porch while she slept upstairs. He brought out 2 mugs of tea, handed one to me without a word. We sipped in silence. I could feel the questions pressing against the air, but none of them broke the surface. He finally spoke. Do you love him? The question landed like a stone dropped in still water. No splash. Just ripples. I did, I said. He nodded. Not surprised. And now? I don't know. He looked out at the trees. The wind moved through them gently, as if even nature didn't want to interrupt this moment. I'm not going to ask why, he said. I think I already know. I just want to understand how long I've been living in someone else's story. I looked down at my mug, fingers tightening around the handle. Too long, I said. He stood, walked to the railing, and leaned against it. Is she mine? The question was softer than I expected. Almost tender. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. She calls you Dad, I finally said. She loves you like a father. You've been there for every milestone, every night she was sick, every first day of school. You are her father. That's not what I asked. I swallowed. The words were stuck. 13 years of secrecy pressed hard against my throat. No, I whispered. He didn't move. Didn't turn around. Just nodded again, once, slow and tired. Okay, he said. It was the calmest destruction I had ever witnessed. No raised voice. No broken glass. Just 2 people standing on either side of a truth they couldn't rebuild from. We stayed at the cabin 3 more days. Pretending, for her sake. We roasted marshmallows. Took photos. Went hiking. She never sensed the finality in our smiles. But I felt it. And so did he. The night before we were supposed to leave, I walked into the bedroom and found him packing. Folding his clothes neatly, placing them in the suitcase with the care of someone closing a chapter. You're not coming back with us, are you? I asked. He paused, then shook his head. I'll drive you home. Then I'll figure things out. Where will you go? I don't know. But not back there. Not now. I nodded. Because what else was there to say? That night, we both lay awake. She slept peacefully between us, unaware of the tectonic shift occurring beneath the skin of her family. I watched the ceiling. Counted the beams. Tried to memorize the sound of his breathing, just in case it was the last time. Morning came like a sigh. We packed the car. Buckled her in. Drove back in near silence. When we pulled into the driveway, he got out, opened her door, kissed her cheek. I have to run some errands, he said. Will you be home for dinner? She asked. He smiled. Not tonight, sweetheart. She accepted the answer. Children do. He helped unload the bags, then got back in the car. I watched him drive away, the tail lights shrinking into the afternoon light. He didn't look back. And I didn't wave. The first night without him was colder than I expected, even though the thermostat remained unchanged. It wasn't the temperature that shifted, it was the absence of his presence, the subtle gravity he carried that had, for better or worse, anchored the air in every room. Now it felt like we were floating, the house unmoored. I tucked her in that evening like always. She didn't ask why he wasn't home. Not directly. She just looked at me with slightly narrower eyes, as if weighing what she already suspected. I kissed her cheek, smoothed her hair, and told her I'd see her in the morning. She nodded, rolled over, and closed her eyes like it was any other Thursday. Downstairs, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair where he used to read the newspaper, sipping his tea slowly, methodically, like it mattered. The quiet was unfamiliar, not because we'd talked much recently, but because now I knew it wasn't temporary. This silence had no resolution. I washed dishes that didn't need washing. Rearranged the spice rack. Folded napkins into triangles. I would have ironed towels if it meant doing something. But no domestic task could scrub away what had been said in the woods or what had remained unsaid on the drive back. That weekend, I found myself dialing his number and hanging up before the call connected. I'd memorized the shape of his name on the screen, the way it popped up in texts or notifications over the years. Now it stayed still. No calls. No messages. He had left, and he was keeping his promise to stay gone. I didn't call the other man either. It's strange how quickly everything can shift from being overwhelming to being unbearable. The guilt that once felt like a weight I carried became something more like gravity itself, inescapable, constant, and suffocating. I began avoiding mirrors. Not out of vanity or shame. Just because I didn't recognize the woman reflected anymore. Her eyes were heavier. Her smile, when it appeared, looked borrowed. And her shoulders seemed tired in a way that lotion or rest couldn't fix. She, on the other hand, adjusted quicker than I had anticipated. Children have a remarkable way of adapting, perhaps because their lives are still being built while ours are just being managed. She still asked where he was, but always casually. A question folded into another, like, is Dad working late, or did he go on a trip? I told her versions of the truth. That he needed some time. That grown-ups sometimes took space. That we loved her very much. And she believed me. Or chose to. Then one afternoon, while we were walking through the grocery store, we passed a man with dark, graying hair and kind eyes, someone I didn't know. She grabbed my hand tightly, whispering, "That looked like Dad." And it hit me how deep this wound would go. How often she would search for his shape in strangers. How I had taken something from her she didn't even know she had yet. At home that evening, I opened a drawer I'd avoided for months. Inside were the old birthday cards he had written her, neat handwriting, always short messages but meaningful ones. So proud of you. Keep being you. Love always, Dad. I laid them out on the table, one by one. She came into the room and paused. Are those from him? I nodded. Why are they out? Because I wanted to remember. She walked over, sat beside me, and began reading each one aloud in a quiet voice. When she reached the final card, she looked up at me and asked, "Is he coming back?" I had no answer that wouldn't be a lie. I don't know, I said. She seemed to accept it, though the way her mouth tightened told me it wasn't enough. I understood. It wasn't enough for me either. That night, I dreamed of our early days. The beginning, when my marriage still had softness. We were never passionate, not the way the stories want love to be. But we were good. We respected each other. We built things. We had plans. I dreamed of our wedding. The way he looked at me, not like a prize, but like a promise. And I woke up with tears already sliding onto the pillow. I wanted to blame someone. Him, for not being enough. The other man, for making me feel too much. Myself, for being too cowardly to tell the truth sooner. But the truth was too complicated for blame. Blame requires clean lines. And nothing in my life was clean anymore. By the second week, I started hearing whispers, friends asking where he was, if we were all right. I gave them short answers, enough to end the conversation. I wasn't ready for opinions or pity. I didn't want anyone weaving their own version of our story. I began to walk every morning. Early, before sunrise. Through the quiet streets where no one would recognize me. The sky still bruised from night, the air sharp with solitude. Those walks became sacred. Not because they healed anything, but because they were honest. No makeup. No masks. Just breath and movement and thought. And it was on one of those walks that I saw him. Not my husband. The other one. He was sitting outside a bakery, coffee in hand, hair slightly longer than I remembered. Our eyes met before I could turn away. He stood. Walked toward me. No smile, just a soft recognition. I didn't expect to see you here, he said. I replied. It was the only thing I could think to say. He glanced down the street, then back at me. Is everything over? I said. He left. He exhaled. Not relief. Not joy. Just the release of something long held. And you? He asked. I don't know. He nodded. Do you want to sit? I looked at the small metal table beside him, the empty chair. I hesitated. Then I said, just for a minute. We didn't talk about the past. Not directly. We didn't talk about the child we shared or the years we lost. We talked about the weather. About the bakery's new owner. About the way early autumn always carried more weight than spring. When I left, he didn't ask for anything. No promises. No visits. Just watched me walk away. Back home, I found her in the living room, reading a book upside down. A habit she had when she was thinking too hard. She looked up at me and asked, "Did you go for a walk?" I nodded. "Did you see anyone?" I hesitated. Then said, "Yes." "Who?" I looked at her carefully. "A friend." She returned to her book. I stood there for a long moment, wondering how many more half-truths I would have to tell. How many versions of the story I would have to offer before the whole thing finally felt honest again. And I knew the answer, maybe none. Maybe honesty wasn't a final destination. Maybe it was a series of small, painful steps in the right direction. And I had just taken one. I had always believed there would be a clear turning point. A moment where I'd feel something click into place, closure, relief, even collapse. But instead, the days that followed blurred into one another, each one wrapped in the same quiet uncertainty. There was no event, no breakdown, no confrontation. Just the slow erosion of one reality, replaced by another I hadn't yet learned to inhabit. We went on living, she and I, in the shell of our former life. The routines remained mostly the same. She went to school. I went to work. We ate dinner together at the small kitchen table. Sometimes we laughed. Sometimes we didn't. Most days, the silence between us felt neutral, not heavy. Other days, it carried the weight of a question she hadn't asked yet. The absence of her father wasn't something she spoke of often. But I noticed the way she stared at the front door around 6 p.m., as if expecting it to open. The way her eyes flicked toward the coat rack, checking for a jacket that hadn't hung there in weeks. She never cried. I don't know if that was strength or confusion or something in between. But I could feel the questions swirling inside her. I could feel them because I carried some of the same ones. I saw him again, the other man. Not deliberately. Just another chance encounter, or maybe not so accidental, given how often I found myself walking near places I knew he liked to frequent. He was sitting on a park bench, this time feeding bits of sandwich to a squirrel bold enough to climb onto the bench beside him. He looked calm. Less tired than before. Or perhaps just more resigned. I sat down beside him without asking. He handed me a piece of his sandwich like it was the most natural thing in the world. We didn't talk much. I think we both understood that words were now just decorations on a wall that had already begun to crack. What mattered wasn't what we said but the fact that we sat in the open, no longer hiding behind doors, windows, schedules. For 15 years, our world had been constructed around secrecy. Now that the secret had begun to crumble, there was a strange freedom in just being seen. Eventually, I spoke. She knows something's wrong, I said. But I don't think she knows what. He nodded slowly. She's smart. She'll know soon. I looked down at my hands. They were clenched in my lap without me realizing. I forced them to relax. I don't know how to tell her, I admitted. Maybe you don't have to tell everything, he said, voice low. Just the part that matters. And what part is that? He looked at me, eyes steady. That she's loved. By everyone involved. That no matter where she came from, she belongs. I exhaled through my nose, more a sigh than anything else. The simplicity of his answer both comforted and shamed me. I had made everything so complicated. Built a palace of lies, thinking I was protecting her, when maybe she just needed something real. He reached over and touched my wrist. Not possessively. Not romantically. Just a gesture of presence. A reminder. We can't change what happened, he said. But we can change what happens next. That night, I lay awake thinking about what he said. What part of the story mattered most? What could still be salvaged? And how to walk a child through a truth I barely understood myself. The next morning, I made her favorite breakfast, pancakes with too much syrup, strawberries sliced into hearts. She looked surprised when she came downstairs and saw the table. Are we celebrating something? She asked. No, I said. I just wanted to start the day right. She smiled. It was small, but real. And I took that as a win. Later that afternoon, she came into the kitchen while I was folding towels and sat at the counter with a quiet intensity that told me she had been thinking. Mom, she said, why doesn't Dad come home anymore? I paused, towel in hand, then set it down slowly. He needed some space, I said carefully. Sometimes adults go through things that are hard to explain. Is he mad at you? No, I said. I don't think he's mad. I think he's hurt. Did you do something wrong? I looked at her. Her face was calm. Open. Not accusatory, just curious. And it broke something inside me. Yes, I said. I made a mistake. A long time ago. A mistake I didn't fix when I should have. She nodded. Is that why he's gone? I took a deep breath. Partly. Yes. She was quiet for a long time. Is it about the man we sometimes see? The one who gives me books and remembers my favorite animals? The question cut deeper than I expected. So she had noticed more than I thought. She had connected pieces I assumed were scattered too far apart to form a picture. Yes, I said softly. She nodded again. Not with shock or anger. Just a kind of acceptance I didn't feel I deserved. Is he my real dad? The words echoed in the room. I had prepared for this, rehearsed answers in my head, but when they came, I felt utterly unprepared. He's your biological father, I said. But the man who raised you, who tucked you in and taught you how to ride a bike and made your lunch every day, that's your dad too. She looked down at her hands. Her fingers played with the hem of her sleeve. Do I have to choose? No, I said immediately. You never have to choose. She looked up at me, eyes shining with something I couldn't name. Then she stood, crossed the room, and wrapped her arms around my waist. I held her tightly, pressing my cheek to her hair. I love them both, she whispered. I nodded, throat tight. So do I. We stood there for a long time. Later that evening, she asked if we could visit him, the other man. Not for a big talk, not for answers. Just to sit. To be. And I agreed. Because the time for hiding was over. And sometimes, the first step toward healing isn't explaining everything. It's simply being present for what's real. The visit wasn't planned. Nothing about that day had been. We were folding laundry, a quiet, ordinary task, when she asked, "Can we go see him today?" Her voice was clear, steady. Not a demand, not a whim. Just a simple request spoken with the weight of someone who had been waiting for the right moment. I looked at her. She held a sock in her hands like it might decide for her. I nodded. Yes, I said. We can. She smiled, not wide, not excited, but soft. Like it meant something deeper than words. I packed a small bag with some of her things, a book, a scarf, a snack she liked. She carried it herself, holding the handles like it was something sacred. The air outside was crisp, the kind that made your skin feel more alive. Leaves crunched beneath our feet as we walked to the car. I didn't rush. Neither did she. It felt like we both knew that this was something new, not a continuation of what had been, but the start of something else. Something uncertain but necessary. He lived on the quieter side of town, where the streets narrowed and trees grew closer to the houses. His building was simple, old, the kind where doors had histories and neighbors nodded but rarely asked questions. As we approached, I glanced at her. She was watching the windows, trying to guess which one was his. I didn't point. I let her wonder. When he opened the door, he looked surprised, but not startled. As if he'd hoped this day would come but never assumed it would. He stepped aside, and she entered without hesitation. I followed, slower, unsure of what space I was stepping into now. The apartment was small, but warm. Books lined the shelves, a mug rested on the windowsill, and a faint trace of cinnamon lingered in the air. She walked around with quiet curiosity, touching objects gently, like she was trying to remember them from dreams she hadn't realized she'd had. He watched her, not with hunger or desperation, but with awe. Like seeing a photograph come to life. She turned to him and asked, "Can I sit here?" pointing to the armchair by the window. He nodded. She sat, pulled her knees up, and opened her book. For a while, we said nothing. The only sounds were pages turning, the creak of wood, the wind outside brushing against the glass. He made tea, offered it with a glance. I accepted. We drank it quietly, sitting across from each other, separated by a child who didn't know how to bridge two worlds but was doing it just by being there. Eventually, he spoke. Not to me. To her. "Do you want to know about the first time I saw you?" She looked up. Yes. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. You were tiny. So small you fit in the crook of my arm. You had your mother's nose and my stubbornness. I knew it from the way you kicked your blanket off, even in sleep. She smiled. I still do that. I know, he said. I've seen. I watched the exchange with something that wasn't jealousy, but not peace either. It was a mix of gratitude and grief. Gratitude that she could know him. Grief that she hadn't known him sooner. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct. I just let them have it. She asked questions. What music he liked. If he had pets. If he ever played soccer. He answered all of them with the patience of someone who understood the rarity of this gift. She asked if he'd ever been to the ocean. He said yes, once. She asked if he'd take her one day. He said he'd like that. When it was time to leave, she stood and wrapped her arms around his waist without being prompted. He held her carefully, like she might disappear. When she pulled back, she said, "You smell like cinnamon." He laughed softly. "That's because I like cinnamon toast." On the drive home, she was quiet. Not distant. Just thinking. "Do you think Dad would ever come visit him with us?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "I don't know," I said truthfully. "Maybe. One day." She nodded. "I think they'd like each other." I smiled. Not because I believed it, but because I wanted to. That night, after she went to bed, I stood in the kitchen, letting the faucet run longer than necessary. I didn't want to think, but the thoughts came anyway. What kind of mother I had been. What kind of woman. What it meant to try to give a child everything when the cost was honesty. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table. The silence was different now. Not accusatory. Just still. There was a knock at the door. Soft, uncertain. I froze. For a moment, I wondered if it was him, my husband. That he'd come back, decided to talk, decided to forgive. But it wasn't. It was my neighbor, dropping off a package delivered by mistake. I thanked her, took it, closed the door slowly. Inside the package was a children's book I'd ordered weeks ago and forgotten about. A story about a tree that loved a bird, even when the bird flew far away. I placed it on the counter, ran my fingers across the cover. The next morning, she found it and asked me to read it to her. I did. And when I reached the part where the bird returns after many seasons apart, she leaned against me and whispered, "That part makes me happy." I didn't tell her why the line made my throat ache. I didn't tell her how sometimes happiness and sorrow sit side by side, holding hands. I just kept reading. Because some stories don't need fixing. They just need to be told. There's something about time that changes after the truth comes out. It doesn't move slower or faster, it just moves differently. As though the rhythm you once knew no longer applies. You begin to measure it not in hours or days, but in questions asked, answers avoided, silences endured. I started counting the weeks since he left. Then I stopped. Because measuring what had been lost only made it feel heavier. The days settled into something resembling a routine, but without the structure I once relied on. She was adjusting better than I expected. I could see it in the way she smiled more easily now, how she didn't linger at the front window anymore. There was a new lightness in her walk, one that came not from certainty, but from being released from confusion. She had a truth now, and while it wasn't simple, it was hers. She began drawing again. Her notebooks filled with quiet scenes, trees, rooftops, people without names. Once, I found a sketch of 3 figures on a hill. One taller, 2 smaller. No faces, just shadows. But they were standing close, and that closeness was everything. He, the other man, started calling every few days. Not to intrude, but just to stay present. He asked about her school, her drawings, what books she was reading. Sometimes he'd leave a voicemail, knowing I wouldn't always answer. His voice was always calm, never insistent. He gave us space, even as he tried to build something new. One afternoon, as I was folding clothes, the phone rang. I expected it to be him. But it wasn't. It was my husband. His voice was quiet, distant, but not cold. "I'd like to see her," he said. "If that's all right." I sat down slowly, the shirt I'd been folding slipping from my lap. Of course, I said. Whenever you want. I was thinking this weekend. Just the two of us. A walk, maybe. Something simple. She'd like that, I said. There was a pause. And you? I hesitated. What about me? Are you all right? It was the first time he'd asked since he left. And it nearly undid me. I'm managing, I said. That's something, he replied. The call ended without ceremony, but the echo of it stayed with me. I told her later that day. She looked up from her homework and blinked slowly. Just me and him, she asked. Yes. If you'd like that. She nodded. I would. That Saturday, he arrived right on time. He looked older somehow. Not in his face, but in his presence. Like someone who had walked through something and hadn't quite come out the same on the other side. She opened the door before I could and hugged him without hesitation. He held her with the kind of carefulness that comes from having known absence. I watched them walk down the street together from the window. She was talking, her hands moving as she spoke. He listened. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw the way his shoulders shifted, relaxed, open. When they returned, she was holding a small paper bag. We got muffins, she said proudly. He let me pick the flavors. Did you get one for me? I asked. She grinned. Of course. He handed it to me, a blueberry one, my favorite. I hadn't told him that in years, but he remembered. He didn't come inside. Just stood at the door, one hand in his pocket. She's doing well, he said. She is. He looked past me, into the hallway. And you? Still managing. He nodded. There was no trace of judgment in his face. Just weariness. And maybe a trace of something softer. A recognition, perhaps, of how far we had both fallen and how quietly we were trying to rise again. Thank you, he said, finally. For letting me see her. She needs you, I replied. However you can be there. He looked like he wanted to say more. But instead, he just stepped back, gave her a small wave, and walked away. That night, she told me what they'd talked about. How he had asked her about school, what she wanted to be when she grew up. How he told her that families didn't have to look one way to be real. That love could stretch in ways you didn't expect. And he said he's proud of me, she added, almost like it was a secret. He is, I said. And then, without prompting, she said, I think he still loves you. Just not the same way. I looked at her, startled. Why do you think that? Because he looked at you like he missed you, she said simply. But not like he wants to come back. It was such a precise observation that I had no answer. I just reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. Later that week, the three of us met again, this time at the park. It wasn't planned. She had suggested it, said she wanted us both there. I agreed, and then called him. He said yes. The air was cool, the sky high and empty. We walked without agenda. She bounced between us, talking about a book she'd been assigned for school. We each held one of her hands. It wasn't strange. Not joyful either. Just quiet. At one point, she let go of both of us to run ahead toward the swing set. We stopped. Stood watching her from a distance. She's resilient, he said. She is. She gets that from you. I glanced at him, unsure how to respond. He wasn't offering praise. Just truth. She gets her steadiness from you, I said. He nodded. We didn't talk about the past. Not then. There were no apologies, no rehashing. We just stood there, in the shadow of trees whose leaves were starting to turn, watching the child we both loved move freely between us. And for the first time in months, I felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Not hope. Not clarity. Just peace. Quiet, unspoken peace. It didn't last. Not completely. Life is too complex for that. But it was real, and I held on to it. Because after everything, it was enough, for now. There was a moment, a few mornings after the walk in the park, when I realized I had stopped flinching every time the doorbell rang. The fear that had followed me for months, of confrontation, of unraveling, of exposure, had begun to fade, replaced by something quieter. Not peace. Not closure. But clarity. The kind that doesn't solve everything but helps you move through the day without holding your breath. I woke earlier than usual, not out of restlessness, but because I wanted to. The house was still and dim, the sky outside barely beginning to lift. She was still asleep, curled into the far side of her bed like she was protecting something in a dream. I watched her for a moment, her soft breathing the only sound in the room, and felt a slow ache settle behind my ribs. I wasn't sad. I was just aware. The kitchen light flickered when I turned it on, a reminder of something that needed replacing. I made coffee, out of habit more than desire, and stood at the window with my hands wrapped around the mug like it might ground me. The street outside was empty, just the usual rhythm of leaves skipping across the sidewalk and a distant dog barking at nothing in particular. I didn't expect a letter. Not in this world of screens and taps and instant replies. But there it was, in the mailbox, waiting in its simple envelope, handwritten. No return address. Just my name. I recognized the handwriting immediately, his. My husband's. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No formal greeting. No date. Just his voice, quiet on the page. I'm not writing to revisit the past, it began. I've done enough of that in my head. I'm writing because there are things that need saying, not to fix, but to release. He went on to talk about her, our daughter. How proud he was of her. How much he missed the everyday things, brushing her hair, checking her homework, hearing her yell from the other room that she couldn't find her shoes. He described memories I had forgotten, how she used to fall asleep with her hands behind her head like a little philosopher, how she hummed to herself while drawing. Then, in smaller script, as if his hand had hesitated, he wrote, I've started to understand that love isn't always what we imagine it to be. It doesn't always protect us from pain. Sometimes, it walks us directly into it. But that doesn't make it less real. The letter ended with a single request, that we continue to be kind to each other. For her. For ourselves. No signatures. Just his name, written without flourish. I folded the letter carefully, pressed it flat between my palms, then tucked it into the drawer next to the stove where I kept old coupons, dried-out pens, and notes from years gone by. It didn't belong there, really, but I didn't know where else to put it yet. That afternoon, I found her sitting by the window with a notebook in her lap. She was drawing again, but this time not rooftops or trees. She was sketching people. I didn't recognize their faces, but I knew the positions. A man seated on a bench. A girl standing beside him. Another woman, further away, watching. They look lonely, I said gently. She shrugged. Maybe. But they're all in the same picture. I didn't say anything. I just sat beside her and watched. Later that week, the other man invited us over for dinner. Not formally. Just a suggestion while on the phone. No pressure, he'd said. Just food and some company. She had overheard and nodded vigorously, already thinking about what to wear. When we arrived, he opened the door with a dish towel slung over one shoulder and a nervous smile that almost made me laugh. The table was set simply, nothing extravagant, just care in every choice. She darted around the room like she belonged there, and maybe she did. The dinner was uneventful in the best way. We talked about books, school projects, funny things that had happened during the week. There were no heavy moments, no big reveals. Just the three of us sharing space, breathing the same air without bracing for impact. After the dishes were cleared and she had wandered into the other room to watch a show, he and I sat across from each other with cups of tea we both forgot to drink. "She's different," he said quietly. "Since everything." "She's freer," I said. He nodded. "She's herself." There was a pause. "And you?" he asked. "I'm learning how to be a person again," I said. "Not just a role." He didn't respond. He just looked at me with something I hadn't seen in his eyes for a long time, respect. Not adoration. Not longing. But the kind of recognition that only comes after loss. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just want to be part of her life. However that looks." "I know," I said. "And you are." When it was time to leave, she hugged him like she had always known how. Not shy, not rehearsed. Just honest. I watched them, that embrace, and something inside me settled. Back home, after she had fallen asleep, I stood in the hallway between our rooms and realized I no longer felt pulled in two directions. For the first time in years, I felt centered. I still didn't know what came next. There was no plan. No grand epiphany. Just a life, unfolding day by day, shaped by choices that no longer needed to be hidden. There would be complications, of course. People would have questions. Family would whisper. But none of that mattered as much as the quiet that had returned to our home, the kind of quiet that feels like calm, not fear. I walked into my room and opened the drawer by the bed. I took out the letter and read it one more time. This time, I smiled. Not because it fixed anything. But because it didn't try to. There's a kind of stillness that follows long after the storm, the kind that doesn't feel like peace, but something more complicated. A space between endings and beginnings. That's where we lived now. Not in the aftermath, but in the quiet space where nothing was fully resolved and nothing needed to be. Our lives had reshaped themselves around the truth, not perfectly, not without bruises, but with a kind of fragile acceptance. The three of us existed in separate orbits that occasionally overlapped, and when they did, it was careful, measured, and mostly kind. There were no longer sharp edges, only pauses and sidelong glances, the shared knowledge of everything we'd been through. She was growing. I noticed it in the smallest things, how she started organizing her school books without being asked, how she corrected my pronunciation when I misread a word from one of her novels. Her world was expanding, and with it, her understanding. I knew questions would come again, deeper ones, more direct. But for now, she seemed content to hold what she knew without demanding more. One morning, as we prepared for school, she placed a folded piece of paper on the kitchen table beside her cereal bowl. I saw it but didn't touch it. "That's for him," she said. "The one who left." I nodded. "Want me to send it?" She shook her head. "I want to give it to him myself." We hadn't seen him in several weeks. The visits had been spaced out, his doing, not hers. He said he wanted to give her room, not crowd her with apologies. I think he also needed time to rebuild something within himself. Trust, maybe. Or identity. That weekend, I reached out. A brief message, no weight to it. "She'd like to see you. She has something for you." His response came quickly, of course. "Whenever you both are ready." We agreed to meet at the library. A neutral place, familiar, quiet. She liked the children's section there, and he had always said it reminded him of his own childhood, dusty corners and the thrill of finding something new in old pages. When he arrived, she ran to him without hesitation. Not with the same small child sprint from years before, but with the confidence of someone who knew she was wanted. He knelt, hugged her, and smiled as she handed him the letter. "I wrote it myself," she said. "No one helped." "I can't wait to read it," he replied. They sat together by the window, her legs swinging beneath the bench, his hands folded around the envelope. I gave them space, wandered between shelves, letting them have the moment. Later, he approached me, the letter carefully tucked into his coat pocket. "Thank you," he said. "Whatever she wrote. I'm not ready to open it yet. But I will be." "She trusts you," I said. He looked down for a moment. "I want to be someone she can keep trusting." "She knows what's real," I replied. "You don't have to prove anything." That night, at home, she asked if I thought he'd cry when he read it. I smiled. "Maybe," I said. "Did you write something that might make him cry?" "I just told him everything I wanted to say," she said. "That's all." I didn't ask what she wrote. I didn't need to. A few days later, another letter arrived. This time addressed to her. The handwriting was familiar, steady, deliberate. She opened it slowly, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, her eyes scanning line after line with quiet intensity. When she finished, she placed the letter on the floor beside her and looked up. "He said he kept one of my drawings on his desk," she said. "Which one?" "The one with the hill. The three people." I remembered that sketch. I remembered how it made me ache. "He said it made him feel like he was still part of our picture," she added. "And is he?" I asked. She looked at me like I'd asked a question with an obvious answer. "Of course," she said. "Pictures don't have to be perfect to be real." I thought about that for the rest of the evening. How often I'd tried to frame my life into something neat, presentable. All those years of arranging our reality like furniture, everything in its place, nothing revealing the cracks. And yet, here she was, understanding more than I ever had. We began to make new traditions. Not out of obligation, but because we needed them. She invited both of them, her fathers, in different ways, to a school performance. They came, sat apart but close enough to speak. They clapped at the same moments. Smiled at the same jokes. I watched them from across the room, and for once, I didn't brace myself for discomfort. The performance was unremarkable. Children forgetting lines, microphones squealing. But it was ours. It was full of faces we loved, voices we recognized. And in that noisy, imperfect gymnasium, we became something resembling whole. Afterward, we all walked to the car together. The night was cool, the air sharp. She ran ahead, her coat unzipped, arms flapping like wings. He, the other man, slowed beside me. "She's becoming her own person," he said. "She always was. We're just starting to see it." He nodded. "Do you think we'll ever be?" "I don't know, settled?" I thought for a moment. Then said, "Maybe not settled. But steady, yes." "Steady's enough," he said. We watched her leap up the curb and spin on her heels, beckoning us forward. And we followed. Not perfectly aligned. But together, in the same picture. The finality of things rarely arrives with a bang. More often, it comes with a quiet nod, a long exhale, a drawer finally closed without hesitation. It took me time to accept that. I used to believe that endings needed declarations or goodbyes spoken under heavy skies. But our ending, of what we were before, was neither abrupt nor dramatic. It simply ended. And something new began in its place, something quieter, more grounded, and perhaps more honest. It happened on an ordinary Thursday. The sky was overcast but not brooding. She had a field trip, and I'd volunteered to chaperone. We boarded the bus together, her hand slipping into mine with the kind of ease that never asked for permission. The children were loud, as they always are, and I sat in the middle row with a clipboard and a pen, pretending to keep order while watching her from the corner of my eye. She laughed more now. A different kind of laugh, not to entertain or deflect, but one rooted in ease. She didn't check the doors anymore, didn't pause at the sound of keys and locks. The weight that used to settle in her shoulders seemed lifted. I hadn't realized how much tension she carried until it disappeared. When we arrived at the nature center, I walked behind the group. She paired off with a friend, holding hands, skipping ahead to examine tree bark and pretend they found dinosaur fossils. I took photos. Not for social media, not to prove anything, but because I wanted to remember this day as it was, simple, complete. That evening, after dinner, we sat on the back porch. The air was cool, hinting at the shift between seasons. She rested her head on my shoulder. "I'm glad you came today," she said. "I'm always glad to be with you." She didn't say anything for a while. The crickets began their nightly ritual. A car passed on the street behind us. The world moved gently. Then she asked, "Do you think we'll always live like this? Just us?" It wasn't a question filled with worry, just curiosity. "I don't know," I said. "Things change. People grow. But this," I squeezed her hand, "this will always be here. You and me. No matter what else changes." She nodded, seemingly satisfied. She got up and went inside, leaving the door open behind her. I stayed outside for a few minutes longer, watching the sky deepen into that perfect indigo that only appears between day and night. Later, I received a message from my husband. Short, simple. Would she like to come with me for the weekend? It wasn't unexpected, but it carried a quiet weight. I told her about it, and she brightened immediately. "Yes," she said. "I want to." She packed her bag herself. Carefully. A book, her toothbrush, 2 sweaters in case the weather is weird. She left a drawing on the kitchen table, folded into quarters. I unfolded it after she left. It was us. The 3 of us. Sitting on a bench under a tree. Nothing dramatic. Just together. The house felt different with her gone. Not empty. Just quiet in a way that felt earned. I cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry, answered emails. But more than anything, I sat with myself. No distractions. No decisions looming. Just me, in the life I had reshaped. I thought about calling the other man. To say what, I didn't know. But I didn't. Not that day. It didn't feel necessary. We had said what mattered. He had his place now, and I had mine. She had both of us, and more than that, she had herself. When she returned Sunday evening, she was glowing. A new confidence in the way she walked, a story on her lips about pancakes and bike rides and a fox they'd seen near the woods. I listened. Every detail. Every exaggerated retelling. She handed me a pine cone she had found and said, "It's for you. Because you like quiet things." And I did. That night, I tucked her in, smoothed her hair, and sat beside her longer than usual. "Are you okay?" she asked, looking up at me. "I am," I said. "I really am." She smiled, turned on her side, and drifted off within minutes. I went back downstairs. Opened the windows. Let the cool air roll in. I made a cup of tea and stood in the kitchen, letting the steam rise into my face. There was no dramatic resolution to be found. No sudden happiness. No perfect ending tied in ribbon. But there was truth now. And space. And love that didn't have to be declared every second to be real. I walked through each room of the house slowly, touching corners, flipping off lights. These walls had held more than secrets, they had held the process of becoming. Of learning that honesty wasn't the opposite of love but one of its deepest expressions. Upstairs, I peeked into her room once more. She stirred but didn't wake. Her hand rested beside her cheek, palm open, as if she were still offering something in sleep. I returned to my room, lay down without restlessness, and closed my eyes knowing there were still questions ahead, still choices to make. But not tonight. Tonight, I didn't have to fix anything. Tonight, I had enough.